Hi everybody, this is Craig Cunningham, your instructor for F&D 510. I'm going to do a little mini lecture here on some ideas that aren't in Tozer but that I discussed in the face-to-face version of F&D 510, and I think these help to sort of put some things in perspective that come in chapters 3 and 4 of Tozer. So I'm going to provide some historical and philosophical background and context for chapters 3 and 4 of Tozer. Chapter 3 you read for last week, and chapter 4 you're reading for this week, so this will kind of tie these things together. So these are some of the major points that I'm going to make. Some would say that psychology is the science of education, that what we do in the classroom should be based upon our understanding of child development, of the way people learn, of the brain research, various other things. But psychology wasn't actually invented until the 1870s. So before then, educators had to base their ideas on other things. We've already seen that religion was one of those things. But in general, if you think of religion as sort of a type of philosophy, earlier educators, prior to the development of psychology, would have based their ideas on philosophy, including religion and other ideas. If you look at the history of these ideas during this time, and I don't really want this thing to come up again. Okay. I didn't expect that. Okay, so back where I was. Okay, so if you look at these ideas, there's kind of a line of thinking that goes from John Locke to Horace Mann, and that sets the stages for the way American schooling developed. And that development of American schooling continued through the 19th century. The invention of psychology in the 1870s heavily influenced people like Charles Eliot and John Dewey, who had ideas about reforming American education around the beginning of the 20th century. They're known as progressives, although as you'll see in chapter 4, they're very, very different in terms of the way they wanted to be progressive. Dewey used his psychology to justify a focus on the development of the child's interests, activities, projects, things like that. Eliot was more interested in testing and how you were going to use testing to set up an efficient school system. And then there's another figure who was mentioned in chapter 4 but not really focused on, Edward Thorndike. And he was a psychologist also who heavily influenced education. Not in the same direction as Dewey or Eliot, but really in the direction of instituting behaviorism in schools, and I'll talk more about that as we go. So the story starts with John Locke, and as you can see here, he was born in 1632 and died in 1704. John Locke, of course, is an extremely influential figure in the history of ideas and had enormous influence over the ideas of those who set up the United States. His focus on individual liberties, his focus on ways people think. I mean, he was one of those people who just kind of thought about a lot of different things. Toward the end of his life, he wrote a book called Some Thoughts Concerning Education. The book was actually written as a series of letters to his nephew, who had just had a child, about child rearing. Locke didn't have any children himself, but he was a physician, among other things, and he had ideas about how children ought to be raised. One of his ideas that comes in another book, not in this one, is that the child's mind is a blank slate, that we're basically born with empty heads, if you will, and that all of everything that we know comes through us, through our experience, through sensation. That idea was enormously influential. It's still fairly influential in the world. We almost sort of take that as a matter of truth, although it's really not true. I mean, the child's brain is not empty in it, really, in any sense. But okay, so he had that idea. He also thought that children should be children, and this was somewhat different from the prevailing view, which was that children should act like miniature adults, and that to an extent that they acted like children, they should be, punished and made to act more adult-like. And Locke didn't agree with that. He also argued against the use of corporal punishment as a way to influence children's behavior. He talked about teaching virtue, teaching it as a kind of a curriculum of virtue, if you will, using the classics, using fables, things like that. And he also emphasized the importance of exercising the capacities of the mind, which form the basis for faculty psychology, which is mentioned very briefly in chapter 2 of Tozer. Locke's book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, was very influential, really the most influential book on education that was written to that point. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a Swiss thinker, lived a little bit later than Locke, read Some Thoughts Concerning Education, and, like others, was influenced by it. But Rousseau wrote his own book, Emile, which was published in 1762, and Emile basically challenged some of Locke's assumptions about the nature of childhood. According to a professor of history of education that I had in my graduate school, this is, quote, the most influential book on education ever written, end quote. Rousseau's effect on education remains very powerful to this day. And you don't necessarily know it when you go into a classroom and look, but hopefully this talk will help you see that influence a little bit. Rousseau developed the idea that each stage of childhood, so infancy, early childhood, sort of boyhood, and he did write mostly about boys' education, adolescence, early adulthood, that each of these stages has kind of its own primary activities or its own approach to learning. But the bottom line was that children learn by exploring their world, by initiating things, by making things, by experience, and that virtue especially, you don't teach virtue to kids, but virtue comes through experience. People learn what's right and wrong by the consequences of things that happen. He also believed that the mind would develop on its own and there was no need to exercise it in the way that Locke would have with a formal curriculum of classics. Rousseau really was, in a way, anti-school. He felt that the best thing for a child was to kind of live a free existence. For example, he didn't think that children should learn how to read until they were 12 or so. But his ideas about the development of stages of childhood and the idea that children kind of emerge from their own insides in a way, and that education is a process of drawing out the potentials and the capacities of students, were very much a central part of Rousseau's book, Emile. Emile influenced a whole line of people, and I'm just going to focus on a couple of them here without going into a lot of details. Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, who was another Swiss educator, very influential, basically took Rousseau's ideas that Rousseau had put in his book and he implemented them with his own children. And from this experience of implementing them with his own children, he refined them and he developed them more into a way of doing schooling. It was less sort of free and more, well, if you have a group of kids, how do you influence them without strictly controlling what they do, et cetera, et cetera. So he had this phrase, learning by head, hand, and heart, which kind of expresses what Rousseau was trying to get at, that people learn through experience. Pestalozzi influenced a whole line of others. Johann Gottlieb Fichte was a German, Prussian philosopher, not so much someone interested in education, but Fichte was influenced by some of the ideas that Pestalozzi had through Rousseau. And Fichte also was very strongly nationalistic. He really believed in the German nation, and his philosophy of German nationality was heavily influential in Prussia around the turn of the 19th century, around 1800, and in the period after that. Another person influenced by Pestalozzi was Johann Friedrich Herbart. Herbart is known as the founder of pedagogy as an academic discipline. Pedagogy is sometimes translated or defined as a science of education. Pedagogy is what we teach teachers, not in terms of specific behaviors, but in terms of the principles that they should operate on. Like how should you treat children? How should you set up your classroom? How should you deliver lesson plans and curriculum? I mean, this is pedagogy. It's what you learn in your methods classes, essentially. And Friedrich Froebel, another follower of Pestalozzi, who was somewhat later, took the idea that children have unique needs and capabilities, and he developed it into a whole kind of approach to schooling. His greatest influence was the invention of kindergarten. And if you think about kindergarten, the idea of a child's garden, that would be a place where children could explore the world in this sort of safety, but under the supervision of a teacher. Froebel had a lot of very influential ideas about how to bring out the uniqueness and the capacities of kids. I'm not going to go, excuse me. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail, but very influential. So this line of thinkers, Pestalozzi, Fichte, Herbart, and Froebel, had enormous influences on the development of the Prussian school system. And as you read in Chapter 3, the Prussians had developed really the first national or state-funded system of education. Children were required to attend. Teachers got specific training in pedagogy. They used a kind of a testing system to decide whether children were headed for intellectual pursuits or more sort of hands-on kinds of things. They had a national curriculum that had to be followed in each grade, and they also had mandatory kindergarten on the lines of what Froebel had suggested for kindergarten. So when Horace Mann went to Prussia, he saw a system that was very different from what existed then largely in New England. As you can see from this picture, I mean, I think the picture is obviously it's a drawing, but the large window, the room with great workspaces for the children, a teacher who is, you know, he looks kind, the kids look like they're relaxed, they're kind of, they're engaged in what's going on. I think that's what the drawing is meant to convey. Back in New England, Puritans had been very influential in education, and the biblical phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" was kind of like a mantra among Puritan educators. It was very harsh discipline. Kids were basically required to sit very still, not to talk, to read. In a way, the Puritans still had a lot of the ideas that existed before Locke. The idea that children are miniature adults, or that if, to the extent that they act like children, it kind of has to be beaten out of them. A very sort of curriculum focused on books and on learning doctrine, using the Bible as a text, etc. And a lot of those ideas continued in the schools of the early part of Mann's career. So Mann, who kind of started out as a Puritan in his thinking, but gradually changed his views into more of a Unitarian approach, which is a much more liberal type of Christianity, developed the idea that schools should not be based on religion. I mean, he did say that schools should teach a common Christian morality. In his way of thinking, I mean, you have to sort of cut him some slack in a way, because we're talking about, 200 years ago. He kind of believed that everyone's a Christian. Anybody who's not a Christian is a heathen. And that disputes among Protestants and Catholics and Unitarians weren't really worth getting upset over, and that the public schools shouldn't get into all that, but should kind of take the essence from all of Christianity and put it into a kind of secularized morality in the schools. So Mann, after he got back from Prussia, he tried to implement a lot of those ideas in the schools of Massachusetts and Connecticut. So he worked for better quality schools, better quality teachers, better quality curriculum, plans for teacher training. He also had this idea that females were better teachers of young children because they were more able to understand emotion, they were more able to understand and be compassionate toward young children, and they could use affectionate means to get the children to participate in the activities. And you can criticize his effect on the schools in terms of both pushing the idea that women are not rational but rather emotional, and also the idea that that women are paid less, although that's not what he advocated. But he was a reformer, and he was definitely generally working to improve the schools. And from this picture, which was in the late 19th century, we don't have a lot of pictures from the early 19th century, but this picture kind of shows what a sort of a classroom with Mann's influence would be. Again, large windows, comfortable desks, an engaging atmosphere, if you will. Now, jumping ahead a bit, the schools that emerged out of Mann, again, based primarily on philosophical ideas, with some religion thrown in, kind of evolved over the course of the later part of the 19th century. And there were some new philosophical ideas that emerged, but I'm not going to talk about those right now. The key thing that happened was that in the 1870s, essentially, there was a new science developed that we call psychology. I have a whole presentation that I've done on that, which I'm actually going to update and then use so that you can see some of what I have to say about the development of psychology. It's actually quite interesting and also quite essential to understanding changes in schooling. All I want to say about that now is that you can really blame or attribute the development of the modern science of psychology to Charles Darwin, who wrote The Origin of Species, basically the theory of evolution. And the thing that Darwin provided to the world, if you look at it through the lens of psychology as an emergent science, is that humans are animals. We evolved from animals, and in our physical characteristics and in terms of how our brains came to exist and how intelligence developed and language and all kinds of other things, that they emerged from natural processes, just like, you know, the tongue on a giraffe, just like the tail of a fish. And whether you believe that or not, that idea, the idea that humans are essentially animals, was enormously influential in thinking about learning. Basically, to put a long story short, if humans are animals, and if our learning is like other animals' learning, then one way to study human learning is to study the learning of animals. And that became kind of a way of doing or of thinking about learning or studying learning without philosophy being the primary focus. So what we can learn by doing experiments and watching animal behavior, rats, pigeons, dogs, we can apply to human behavior. And psychology is really nothing if not the application of ideas that come from animal research to trying to understand humans. In the context of the development of this new science of psychology came along John Dewey, who was initially trained as a philosopher, but was aware of the development of the new science and began to sort of use psychological principles that were emerging from this new science to support his philosophical ideas about education and in support of progressive ideas. And in Chapter 4, you'll get a better sense of what he was about. Also, Charles Eliot, who was president of Harvard. He didn't have a background necessarily in philosophy. I think he was a theologian originally. But as I mentioned, religion and philosophy are related. And Eliot also used some of the ideas of psychology that were emerging, particularly the idea of the measurement of intelligence as a way to classify kids into different groups. Also used new psychology as a way to justify some of his views on education. Another person that you need to be aware of is Edward Thorndike, who strictly a psychologist, no background in philosophy, no pretension to philosophy, although as I say that I realize that I could contradict myself there, but a psychologist, did a lot of work with pigeons originally, learned a lot from pigeons about learning, and applied a lot of those ideas, including other ideas that came from other psychologists, to educational ideas. Because Thorndike looked specifically at animals like pigeons and how they learn, a lot of his ideas that he came to apply to the education of humans are very behavioralistic. So just to say very quickly, the idea that children respond to positive and negative reinforcements, that if you want a child to do something, you have to reward them positively. If you don't want a child to do something, you have to give them some kind of consequence that they don't like. Schools in America today use a lot of behaviorist principles. A lot of what you learn in your classroom management courses is based on the behaviorism that Thorndike really initiated and which has been developed down to the present day, colored with some other ideas, of course. Modern psychology, that is psychology today, is certainly not the same simplistic thing that it was in Thorndike's day. However, this is a quote from a historian of American education, Ellen Lageman, who did a long study of the influence of Thorndike and Dewey on American education, and her conclusion was, one cannot understand the history of education in the United States during the 20th century unless one realizes that Edward Thorndike won and John Dewey lost. If Dewey has been revered among some educators, Thorndike's thought has been most influential within education. It helped to shape public school practice as well as scholarship about education. Now, I can't begin to justify this statement right now, but I think as we go through the next few weeks of the course, I think you'll begin to see why Lageman said that. So just to recap, psychology might be the science of education, but it wasn't invented until 1870, so ideas about education that came before then had to come from somewhere else. They tended to come from philosophy and religion. And there's a line of ideas from John Locke, through Rousseau, through Pestalozzi, Herbart, Froebel, Fichte, that influenced Prussian education. Prussian education heavily influenced Horace Mann and set the stage for the development of American schooling in the late 19th century. And when the progressives came on, including Dewey and Eliot, they basically took the development of American education at that point and kind of weaved into their ideas the new psychology in order to justify their own approach. Dewey really, in a lot of ways, was agreeing with Rousseau about the way that children learn. Eliot, not so much. Eliot was more, I would say, probably like Horace Mann, similar in that regard. But both of them used psychology to justify their approach. And then other psychologists, really behaviorists like Edward Thorndike, had also enormous influences on the development of schooling. So that's it. I hope you got something out of this, and please give me some feedback, either in your weekly reflections or just send me an email, and I'll think about whether I'm going to do similar talks later in the course as this one was. Be well.